to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We have a returning guest. My buddy Jordan is here today. And what we're going to show you how to do is replace a U-joint on a drive shaft. The vehicle that we're working on is a third generation 4Runner. There is something unique about the third generation 4Runner U-joints that you don't necessarily see on other vehicles. The difference that we found is the way the yoke is made. The yokes actually taper inboard. It's not just a flat, even surface on the yoke. This taper causes a problem with certain tools you want to use to get this job done. Part of my research is I looked up other YouTube videos and I saw some techniques that people use. One was using a ball joint C-press. Another technique was just using a bench vise. And a third technique is you just use a couple sockets and use a hammer and you drive the bearing cups out. Since I have a OTC ball joint C-press, I thought that was going to be my go-to tool. But the problem is, because of the way the yoke is shaped with the taper, the C-press doesn't really affix onto the yoke very well and it wants to slip on you. So it caused problems with us driving the bearing cups out and also driving the new ones in. So Jordan and I already completed this job. We were successful replacing the U-joint on his rear drive shaft, but it wasn't easy, and we decided that we wanted a second try at it so we can show you a more clear-cut way without any guesswork to get the old U-joint out and the new U-joint in. There is another part of the rear drive shaft known as the double cardan joint, and the opinion with that joint is that if you have a bad U-joint in that joint, you pretty much just trash the drive shaft and you get another used one, or you get maybe an aftermarket one from a place like Tom Woods. Because Toyota doesn't provide replacement U-joints or a replacement ball for the center joint of the cardan joint, they don't offer it, so you have to go aftermarket. And the problem is it's hard to source quality parts for the U-joints in that center ball. So most people are of the opinion that you just get rid of the drive shaft if you have any problems with that double cardan joint. So we're gonna use some footage from our first time meeting and doing this job on Jordan's truck, and then what we did is we got a donor slip yoke from a guy on t4r.org. His screen name is Sleepy Dad, and so he was nice enough to send us his slip yoke and a replacement U-joint so we could film this again and show a more clear-cut way to get this job done. All right, let's get started. Here is the OEM U-joint in its box, and there's the part number.
So it looks like we've got a center part. I guess you call this a yoke.
They actually call that the trunnion.
The trunnion. Here's the 4 caps, pre-assembly greased, I guess, and then the 4 snap rings.
So you have your 4 caps, and when you look inside there, you're going to see needle bearings around the whole inner diameter of that cap. So if some of the needle bearings happen to get displaced and we're down at the bottom of the cap, then you'd want to just take a little screwdriver or whatever and push them back against the sidewalls of the cap. All right, we're ready to get started on this job. We have the truck prepped by having the front wheels chalked, and then we have the rear end jacked up, the axle housing supported on 6-ton jack stands, and we have the parking brake off, and we have the transmission in neutral. And the reason why we want the parking brake off and the transmission in neutral is so we can rotate the drive shaft to have easier access to all the 14mm bolts and nuts that hold the drive shaft to the third member. We're underneath the truck. Here's your transfer case, and there's that notorious double cardan joint, and you'll see that both of the zerk fittings are facing the same direction. Right now they're facing towards the ground. As you travel to the rear of the vehicle, you'll notice the rear slip yoke also has the zerk fitting facing the same direction, facing towards the ground. So going towards the rear of the vehicle, and you'll see that the zerk fitting for the slip yoke is facing towards the ground. Then when you look inside the yoke at the other zerk fitting for the U-joint, it's also facing the same direction. This slip yoke and the main propeller shaft or drive shaft are balanced as a unit. You can see a weight right here. It's important to get everything back in the same orientation. Before we take this off, we're going to make a match mark on the main propeller shaft and the yoke so we get it back in the same position. And then The factory service manual also recommends putting a match mark on the flange of the yoke and the flange of the third member. Now, this connection really doesn't make as big of a difference because it's not part of the balancing of the drive shaft. And if you ever updated your third member, say you took your third member out to get different gears installed, you got a different third member, well, now it doesn't really matter because your match mark on the old one isn't going to help you out. So this match mark connection, like I said, isn't really a big deal. The main one is you want to get this slip yoke matched up with the propeller shaft the way it came and the way it was balanced. The reason why I made mention of the orientation of all the zerk fittings, for example, you went to a wrecking yard or you pulled off your rear drive shaft and you messed up and you didn't put match marks, by simply getting all the zerk fittings in the same orientation, you can pretty much guarantee that your drive shaft is going to be rebalanced, because Toyota balanced all the drive shafts in the same orientation with all the zerk fittings facing the same way. We're going to use a paint pen to make our match marks on the propeller shaft and the slip yoke. So Jordan's going to clean up with some alcohol first so we can have a better chance of being able to make good match marks.
While we're at it, I figure we just mark this, this, and this all together.
You'll see he made a match mark from the propeller shaft onto the yoke, and then he marked the orientation of everything else. He's got a mark here and a mark here. So if we line everything up like this, after we get the new U-joint in position, we'll know we have it all in the right orientation.
This U-joint isn't bad, but it's going bad, and the reason that I was able to tell was when I replaced my third member recently, I wobbled this around and I found that one of the directions had sort of a catch in it, and so I thought proactively I should replace this rear U-joint.
So now we're going to work on getting the slip yoke disconnected from the third member. They're 14mm bolt and a 14mm nut on the back side. So we're going to utilize my little DeWalt with a 14mm box end wrench and zip these off.
We're gonna have to do this one the old-fashioned way.
My little impact gun couldn't get that one, so Jordan's going to do it the old-fashioned way with brute strength.
There we go.
There he goes.
My favorite way is to put these things just offset and then just squeeze them together. You can actually get a lot of force that way.
Once you get 3 of them out, before you take the last bolt and nut out, you got to be thinking of supporting the drive shaft somehow, so when you get that bolt out, it doesn't come crashing down on your face. Now, a lot of times you take the last bolt out and you still have to tap on the end of the drive shaft to break it free of the third member, but you don't want to take a risk on that. So before you get your last bolt out, tie it up somehow. So Jordan just has this strap that he's running from one side of the truck to the other and wrapped around the drive shafts. It's going to support it when we take the last bolt out and disconnect the slip yoke. With the drive shaft supported, now he's going to take the last bolt out. Even though Jordan recently replaced this third member and the drive shaft connection to the third member isn't a connection that's been on there for a long time, it still got kind of hooked on there. So we're going to tap it with a plastic mallet and break it free.
See, we got a little separation. It's worth noting that the way this mates up, there's actually a little centering ring that mates up into the flange. That's what we're trying to get to pull out.
There it is, and that thing. Yeah, your bungee cord wasn't really strong enough.
Never mind. Never mind.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's not really doing the job, is it?
No, it isn't.
Baling wire would have been better. Now that we have the drive shaft supported better with some baling wire up above, a little trick is if you take out the zerk fitting for the slip yoke, then it will reduce the suction to where you can pull out the slip yoke from the propeller shaft easier. So Jordan's going to use a 7mm socket with a 1/4" drive ratchet, and he's going to take that zerk fitting out so we can pull the slip yoke off easier.
There we go.
Okay, the zerk fitting's out. Now he could just pull straight backwards on the yoke and separate the two pieces. Just like so.
Okay.
You see, you have the male splines on the main propeller shaft, and then you have the female splines on the slip yoke. So now we're going to get this on our workbench. So we have the slip yoke off the vehicle on the workbench, and now Jordan's going to talk about a few things we noticed.
Here's the phenomenon I noticed last time, and this is why we're replacing it. In this direction, the bearings feel nice and smooth. In this direction, you can see it. There's a definite catch in there. We've got a full range of motion, but there's a weird spot right there.
So what Jordan was explaining is that in the one direction where he felt an odd movement, it basically feels like the bearings are dropping into an indentation. It should be one continuous, fluid, smooth feeling when you're working the U-joint back and forth, but it obviously has a clunk to it where the bearings drop into like a depression. That is a sign that something is definitely wrong.
So then while we have it on the bench, I just wanted to note a few other things. Here's the grease zerk. It's in line with this grease zerk, so let's note that for when we put it back together. The other thing I wanted to check on, I scraped a little bit of the original road gunk off of these bearing caps just to see where they sit right now, to understand generally how it probably needs to look when it goes back together. And what I'm noticing is that on the small part, the bearing cap is nearly flush with the casting at the end. And that's true for this too. On the larger portion, it's inset just a little more and nearly flush on this side, inset 0.010 of an inch maybe. So just wanted to note how this all looks and study it before we take it apart.
Now say for instance you're working on a different vehicle, you have ones that will have external clips and internal clips. If this was an external clip style U-joint, you would see a C-clip right here, and it would be in an indentation in this yoke. Where the clips are going to be on this U-joint, they're going to be on the inside. So as soon as we clean off all this gunk and grease and dirt, we're going to be able to see where that C-clip is. We're going to clean up all the old grease and dirt so we can expose those C-clips. There's going to be one per side, so there's going to be a total of 4 clips that we have to remove. We have the slip yoke cleaned up a bit to where you can now see the C-clips a lot easier. So we're noting the orientation of some of these clips. You can see the opening of the C-clip pointing upward here, but then when you look on its opposite side, the C-clip is facing the other direction. It's closed here, the open side is on the other side. When we look at the C-clips for this one right here, they decided to put the C-clips both in the same orientation with the open face facing the same direction. I don't think it matters because all you want is the C-clip in place so it holds the U-joint securely to the yoke. We have the slip yoke in the jaws of my bench vise, and I have these soft jaws grabbing it. The first part we're going to try to free is this part of the yoke that attaches to the third member. The factory service manual says to grab a brass drift and tap on the cap a little bit. And I think the reason why they say to do that is so it just takes a little bit of pressure off the C-clip, and then it's easier to get the C-clip out with a screwdriver. So Jordan's just using one of my big brass drifts, and he's just gonna tap on it fairly lightly, not a whole lot of force. So it looks like on this edge, you can get the screwdriver right on the end of the clip and hammer it and drive it out.
Okay. Okay, well it's certainly spinning.
Is it coming out at all?
Yes, it is actually.
Okay.
It's spinning and coming out.
So you can see the edge of the clip is starting to come out on the opposite side. And when it goes flying, you're done. Now we're going to flip it over and get the opposite side out. If you were in the Rust Belt part of the country and you had a lot of corrosion, you might be fighting this a lot more. So it probably would be prudent to spray some penetrating oil around the C-clip first before you try to get it free. Since we're spoiled in California Bay Area, we don't have rust issues, so it came out without a fight. So now Jordan is going to flip the yoke and we're going to get the other C-clip out. Same procedure. Give it a little knock and then use a screwdriver to drive out the C-clip. The C-clip was pointing the different direction, so he has to go from this side. You could probably grab that. There you go.
There we go.
And then that one's out. So now we're going to support the yoke right here in the soft jaws of my vise. Say for instance, if you had the whole big drive shaft or propeller shaft, what you don't want to do is squeeze really hard on the drive shaft. So if you were going to stick it into your vise, you just want it to barely grab without a lot of pressure so you don't damage the tube of your drive shaft. We just got the C-clips out. Now we're going to start pressing the bearing cups out. What Jordan and I learned the first time is that you have to be careful how far you drive the bearing cups. Each bearing cup has to come out its respective side. You can't just drive all the way on one side, get the cup out on the opposite side, and then get this cup out this side. They each have to come out their own end. When we're driving on this side to get the opposite bearing cup out, you could end up driving too far. Basically, the end of the bearing cup will come unhooked from the yoke. And the problem that gives you is that now you have to realign this cup in order for it to be driven out this way. And that caused us a lot of grief because we at first couldn't get it driving out square, and it started scoring up the inner diameter of the yoke and took a little bit of metal off. We're going to be really careful of how far we first drive this direction to where we get the other cup exposed, but we don't fully push this bearing cup out the other side. What we're showing here is the shortcomings of using a ball joint C-press. You can see that we have this side square against the bearing cup, but then when you look on the other side, because of the way that the yoke is tapered, it's only grabbing on this back side. As you start to turn the spindle and press the cups out, this thing wants to move on you because it's only connected on one little edge. We put like little pry bars and screwdrivers and washers in here to help take up this gap to stabilize the C-press, but nothing really worked that great. We did get it done, but it was kind of ugly, and so that's why we're just going to abandon the C-press idea and use a different technique using a 2-jaw puller.
Here's a new cup to show us what is actually embedded inside of this yoke here. There's a groove for the snap ring. So when we put the 2-jaw puller on either side of this, we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently put the jaws where it's going to grab and stop it from pressing outward. So we'll set it up and basically move it outward ever so slightly. To get the puller to fit, the U-joint can't be straight. We actually have to access it while it's turned.
It's kind of a fine thing, so you have to have a good set of eyes and really look in there to make sure that the very tips of this 2-jaw puller aren't going into the groove for the snap ring, so it's going to inhibit us driving the cup this way.
So as we crank on the puller, the yoke is going to come up this way, exposing the bearing, pushing that bearing out that side so that we can grab it. And we just want to make sure as we push this bearing cap, it doesn't go so far that it loses its alignment.
We have the 2-jaw puller in place, and now Jordan is going to tighten down on the spindle. We're going to start driving the cups out.
It's worth noting that at no time does the puller load up like you're popping a ball joint. It's been just a steady pressure. It hasn't, loaded up like it's going to go bang.
Okay, we don't want to go too far, so we're going to take a measurement. So we're holding up a new bearing cup to the yoke, and we're just kind of getting an eyeball of how much of the bearing cup is still in the yoke. And there's still a decent amount in there.
To be safe. So we're getting pretty close. I think we can maybe go another turn or so. You can see that side is just a little less than 1/8 of an inch from basically being totally exposed. Yeah, let's stop here.
Let me see it.
And I think we have enough to grab on that side.
It's still in the yoke on this side about 1/8 of an inch, and now we're going to flip it around and try to get that cup out on the opposite side.
We don't want this bearing race to press any further lest it lose its alignment. What we realized we could do is, by bearing against this yoke, we can push the spider upwards in order to force this out while leaving that one intact, because the spider will slip out of it. So we're going to put this here. These are aluminum jaws so that we don't mar the yoke, and we found a 29mm socket fit over this pretty well. We're going to hit this, thereby forcing that bearing upwards. Yep, making lots of progress. And let me just make sure nothing wrong is happening to this one. Yep, you can actually see how the spider has started to separate out of that one. I'm not hitting this with a lot of force. We used the puller to get it started, and now we're helping it along the caveman method.
See how it's bottomed out right there?
Oh, yes.
You can't go any further.
Yep, it's bottomed out. Good call, Tim.
So this yoke is bottomed out on this bearing cup, so we can't go any further. So after getting the bearing cup exposed as far as we could, we tried the usual method of grabbing it with a channel locks. We used a little bit of heat with a butane torch on the yoke to hopefully expand the yoke a little bit in order to get the bearing cup out easier. But neither of those techniques did anything for us. So Jordan came up with a good idea. He figured if we ground down a flat section on opposing sides of the bearing cup using my bench grinder, we could then sandwich the bearing cup in my bench vise to where it could hold it really firmly, and then we could twist the yoke and basically force the bearing cup out of the yoke. We were able to get the bearing cup in a better position, a little bit closer to the wheel, with getting these guards out of the way. So we just removed the guard on this old Craftsman bench grinder, and we were able to get the cup in a better position to grind a nice flat section on opposing sides. After grinding opposing flat edges on the bearing cup, now we have it captured in my bench vise so we can get a really good grip at it, and we're going to twist it and try to slide that cup out. Just by twisting, you can't get the bearing cup out. You need to twist and also give a little pressure to be able to displace the bearing cup out of there. So Jordan has a pry bar prying up against the top of my bench vise and putting pressure on the yoke while twisting, and this is the way we're going to get this cup out. We're actually going to do a partnership here.
There. We're nearly there, I think. Yeah, it's off. Woohoo!
It wasn't pretty, but we got it done. So let's show you how we did this. We ground down a pretty good flat section on both sides to where basically you can either get a channel locks, or the way we did it, put it in the vise so it grabs it really firmly. It takes two people, so Jordan was twisting the whole joint while I was applying some upward pressure on the yoke to get the bearing cup to slide out of the yoke. So this is the way we did it.
We've got our 2-jaw puller in place again, and what we're going to try to do is press against the spider to pull this yoke upwards, thereby pushing that cap out that side. Yeah, so we clearly had enough meat left over for alignment purposes. We can take this until it bottoms, which is now. Once this gets far enough, we have enough room to just lever it out. Now we don't have to go through the pain of grinding slots and everything, we just press it out. Now we have the yoke supported again in the 2 jaws of the bench vise, and we're just going to use a punch to finish pushing this through.
It's out of there. This was actually a brass drift that Jordan used, but you could use a punch, whatever, because you don't care about the bearing cup anymore, you're replacing it. So we now have the first yoke off, and now we're going to work on the next one. We have the same setup again. We have the 2-jaw puller, and we're only going to drive this cup as far as we feel comfortable so we don't displace it out of the yoke.
And we have movement.
Let's not go too far now.
Yep.
We're taking a measurement, just seeing how much of that bearing cup is still in there.
We can go another turn or so. Okay, let's stop here, and now we can use our previous trick. Now we don't have a yoke attached, but we can bear down on the two sides of this to force this one even further.
So this time, because this other yoke is out of the way, we actually have the trunnion being supported on either side of the bench vise with, again, the aluminum jaws, and he's going to put the socket on top and pound down on the yoke to get this cup out a little bit further.
Now it's bottomed out.
All right.
And look, we actually were able to get that considerably further. So because the spider or trunnion here is free of these bearings, we were able to force this side a lot further through. No need for the grinder or any of those special tricks. It just comes right out. And now we're just going to use our puller again to force it that way.
2-jaw puller. We're going to drive this as far as we can, and then we'll be able to get this trunnion all the way out.
Okay, now our spider yoke should just come right on out. The trunnion.
Don't be giving a different name.
Sorry. I think it's also called a spider.
Oh, a spider? Okay. Same technique. Capture the yoke by the jaws of the bench vise. He's going to use the brass drift, and he's going to knock that cup out. And there it is. We have the U-joint all the way out. In order to prepare the yoke for the new U-joint, I'm just taking some fairly fine steel wool, and I'm just cleaning out the inside of the yoke really well. And there's not really any corrosion to speak of. I'm just getting the surface nice and smooth and free of any little grit in there. I'm going to do this with both yokes.
When ordering parts for myself, I found there was some confusion about what was the right part for the rear U-joint. In this case now I have two different ones to look at. The difference between these two part numbers is just in the suffix here. One is a 70 and one is a 60. I used a 70 for mine and it worked fine. So we're suspicious that the 60 might not be quite the right thing. What we have here in front of us, this is the 60, all put together. On the face of it, it looks very much the same. But we notice the only difference is that the cups are deeper in the 60 than the 70. So if you compare it, the 60 on the left, you can see, is about a 1/16 of an inch longer. All the diameters appear to be about the same. Other features are the same, and then if we compare with the ones that we just took apart, they match in length with the 70 part number. Also, you'll note the 60 has just a flat end of the cap. The 70 has a divot. The parts we removed also have a divot, although of a slightly different size. So we are going to utilize this number 70 kit, which has the slightly shorter caps. So now we have the larger yoke secured in the vise, and we have the trunnion. The zerks line up, and the zerk goes on the inside towards the big yoke. So we're going to get it into place like this. And what we want to be very careful of is as we bring the two caps in, we want to make sure that it's always aligned with the needle bearings. If the shaft goes in sideways, it could very easily tip one of these needle bearings out, and then we'd have to go in and fix it. So we're going to start it on one side, back the trunnion away, push this in a little bit. See, there's a relief. Now it's starting to actually have a little bit of friction. And then I'm going to put this in carefully. There we go. Now same thing here. Get it started, and then there we go. See, it's moving freely, which means it has some contact with both sets of needle bearings. And I'm just going to pretend I'm He-Man here. That's what we want the vise to do, so I can't do that.
If you slide the bearing cups onto the trunnion and you get some type of resistance, that means one of the needle bearings probably displaced. So don't force it. Pull the cup back off, get in there with a little screwdriver, and then just push the needle bearing back against the wall of the bearing cup, and then try again.
Now we're going to use our vise to basically press these two together. Whoop, make sure this guy stays in the middle, keeping our needle bearings aligned. We're just going to use the vise as a technique to get these started. And as I proceed, I'm going to make sure that this thing still turns smoothly and slides a little bit in and out. One is preferring the other. Now this has bottom against the yoke, so we can keep going, and now this side's going to press in. No, I'm not. That doesn't feel right. We're going to stop there.
This side bottomed out for us. This other side is starting to load up. We think that we're putting a lot of pressure with the trunnion against this bearing cup. So instead of continually trying to do it with the vise, we're going to transition to the 2-jaw puller and then drive this cup where we expose the slot for the C-clip, and then we're going to flip it over and do the same thing and expose the C-clip on this side utilizing the 2-jaw puller.
We have our puller grabbing the yoke, not the bottom side of the bearing. That would not be good. And now we are going to start pressing the bearing cap in, moving very smoothly. The way that the old one was set up, the face of this bearing cap was almost even, slightly inset to this surface of the yoke. So we'll kind of use that as a reference as we go. We want to look for that snap ring slot to start to show up. There it is. Okay, now let's get one of our new snap rings. Your kit will come with 4 new snap rings. Don't use your old ones. It looks like we're almost there. You can use it as a little feeler gauge. There, we're there. I'm actually going to go just the tiniest bit. There, okay. Now that this snap ring slot is exposed, we're going to pop the snap ring in. There.
So Jordan just tapped on it with the brass hammer. Now he's going to finish driving it home with a drift. And it snapped in place. Now we're going to flip the yoke around and drive the other bearing cup to where we expose the groove of the C-clip and get that C-clip in.
And quick sanity check, still moving smoothly. If at any point it binds really badly, it's okay if it feels a little grainy, but if it binds and you can't move it at all, then something's not right.
Now we're driving this cup in, and we're going to use one of our new C-clips as a feeler gauge to see how far we need to go. Needs to go a little further.
There we go.
A little more, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Good. Okay, remember we have to match up our paint colors, so we have the red paint on this side and the red paint here. Same process where we get this over the trunnion. Get this just started with a bit of friction, making sure that it's captured on the needle bearings. I'm going to slide this back a little ways so that I'm able to kind of get this onto the shaft before pressing it in. There we go. So we're on both and it's rotating, so our needle bearings are in place. So now we will use the bench vise again to squeeze these together to get them started. Okay, we're getting a little motion from both of them, making sure that it's still free.
If you tilt it the other way, you can get further, because now you're bottoming out here. So if we turn it upside down, you can get a little further.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Just on to about 2/3 of the face of those bearing caps.
That one, that side's bottomed out.
Yeah, so we'll stop with that. Whenever you start to encounter some force, we'll stop using the vise and go to the puller. We have the U-joint tipped in both directions to make room for our 2-jaw puller. And we're going to proceed to press this bearing cap in until the snap ring slot is exposed. It's going in quite freely. Not freely, but a good gentle amount of force. Okay, starting to show up. I think that's probably about it. It just barely slipped in, but we want to go just a little bit more to make sure that it's going to snap all the way around. Okay. Okay, here's the snap ring. We've got it in the slot. We're going to utilize the same process of tapping with a brass hammer to get it to start. There we go. Great.
That snapped all the way in. Now we're going to do the same with the other side.
Okay, we've got our last bearing to press in. Okay, it wants to go just a little further. Okay. Whoop. There, and I think they're both in quite solidly. So now that we have it all assembled, what we want to do is make sure that the bearings are equalized so that everything can move freely. As we've pressed it in, it's moving smoothly, but kind of a lot of resistance. In the factory service manual, it talks about how there's a minimum spec for the amount of axial play, which is how far the trunnion can move in and out of the bearings. Right now, the trunnion is essentially captured by the bearings. It has a little bit of preload. We want to kind of take that off and give it just the tiniest bit of room to move in both directions so that the bearings can move smoothly. So the way we're going to accomplish that is similar to how we press the bearings out. We'll support under the yokes and tap this way to use the trunnion to basically back the bearings back out 0.5 of an inch at the most. We're going to be working on these two bearings. See how this feels. Kind of a modest amount of force. It's actually pretty good. We're going to see if we can improve it a little bit. So I'm just going to tap on the yoke itself. Getting better already. Remember, the snap rings are in place, so the bearings cannot be forced back out. They're basically just being forced back up a tiny bit. There. That feels great. Brand new bearings, so we don't expect it to be sloppy. Not at all, but very, very smooth and easy. This way is much stiffer. We're going to deal with these two bearings by supporting this yoke on the vise and pressing this yoke up and down a tiny bit. This is the motion we're trying to correct. This is fairly stiff. Oh yeah, there we go. And I'm going to call that good.
All right, we are done.
You're going to feed me lunch now, Tim?
Yes. Before we get the slip yoke back onto the drive shaft, Jordan just wants to make sure by squirting grease into the zerk fitting that we're going to get grease squirting out of each cap. So right now it's pushing out the OEM grease that the U-joint came with. Okay, he's basically pushed out all the original grease and now it's got his choice of U-joint grease squirting out of each cap. The first video that we actually ever made for our YouTube channel was talking about the slip yoke and the binding problem there is. And it's been my theory that the upper splines get poorly greased with the zerk fitting being way the hell down here. You're depending on the male portion of the propeller shaft to slide down, dip into the grease that's in the bottom of the yoke, and then drag it back up. What Jordan is going to do to just get this slip yoke grease a little better, he's just going to use some of the grease and just manually lubricate the splines like I did in that video. Work it, work it.
There we go.
Work it. Okay.
Excelente.
So, moment of truth. We're going to get the slip yoke back onto the main drive shaft or propeller shaft. You can see our orange match mark on the main shaft, and we have to match up the slip yoke match mark with the other match marks. You could only get it on one way, and that's the right way. Note that the zerk fitting is off to give the air pressure somewhere to escape. And he's bringing the two sides together and making sure his match marks are good, which they are.
Okay.
So now he's going to bring it up against the third member and he's going to get one of his bolt and nuts started. There we go. He can finally let go of the drive shaft now that he's got one bolt in there. We're not going to show getting all the bolts started. The torque spec for these drive shaft bolts is 54 foot-pounds. So Jordan's holding the back nut with a 14 millimeter box end wrench. Then I'm using the torque wrench on the front side with a short 14 millimeter socket and a short extension. We got all the bolts tightened to 54 foot-pounds, and then Jordan is going to get his zerk fitting back into the slip yoke. Yep. Just remember that this is a very small fastener, so you don't need a lot of force. Don't over tighten it and break off the zerk fitting. As a final step, he's gonna inject some grease into the slip yoke zerk fitting.
Since we cleaned it out, this might take a while to pump it up, so.
All right, Jordan and I are done with another U-joint replacement on a Toyota 4Runner rear drive shaft. We struggled, but we were ultimately successful, but we had to pull a lot of tricks out of our bag to finally get it done. And we wanted to show you a much more clean way to do it. What I thought was gonna work with a little bit of heat to get those bearing cups out actually didn't work all that great. Jordan came up with a really good idea of grinding a flat section on opposing sides of that first bearing cup. And then by utilizing the bench vise, grabbing the bearing cup really strongly in the bench vise, one person is twisting it while the other person is using a pry bar. That enabled us to get that first cup out. So once you get that first bearing cup out, then you take your 2-jaw puller and you drive as far as you can the other way. Once you do that, you can get the yoke off of the trunnion. And then you saw how we did it. We just got a brass drift and we captured the yoke against the jaws of the vise and we just knocked it out. Easy peasy. Then we used the same technique with the other yoke, and what we found is that because the bearing cup's already off one side of the trunnion, now everything was a lot easier. As soon as we drove out the first side with the 2-jaw puller, we were able to get it out easy because we're able to drive further without the opposing bearing cups in our way. And as you saw, getting everything back together is also pretty straightforward using the techniques we showed. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is if you can get past that very first bearing cup, you're golden. Everything's going to go smooth for you. Granted, with automotive work, anything could happen and you could have difficulty after getting that first bearing cup out. Pay attention to the video, avoid the pitfalls that we shared with you so you will have a much easier time doing this job. Andy, if you're watching this, I hope you're happy. The U-joint you provided us wasn't the right one, but luckily I had one for you, so I hooked you up. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean, and special guest Jordan, who was invaluable because the guy's got a good mechanical brain and I couldn't have done it without him. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. And as always, sick mods.